Profesor Noam Chomsky, en su obra Estados fracasados, el abuso de poder y la agresión a la democracia, señala una serie de características propias de Estados Unidos que nos sirven para afirmar que en esta nación el Estado ha fracasado o fallado. Bajo esta misma perspectiva, en el caso de México, ¿podemos igualmente hablar de un Estado fracasado? De ser así, ¿cuáles serían sus características particulares y, sobre todo, ¿se trataría de un Estado fallido importado estratégicamente desde Estados Unidos?
Well, I did write a book called Failed States, which was about the United States primarily. And I pointed out that the United States has many of the characteristics of states that we call failed states. So the state authorities choose not to protect the population from attack, from destruction, from terror, and so on. Not being willing to protect the population is one characteristic of failed states. The United States has democratic forms, older, maybe better than anyone else, but they don't function. So there's a huge gap between public opinion and policy. I mean, I mentioned a couple of examples, but extends over domestic and international policy very widely. Well, it's another characteristic of what we call failed states. They may have democratic forms, but like, say, in Russia, they had elections under the communists, but they didn't function democratically. So it's another characteristic. So should we call the United States a state that has failed? Well, it depends. You have to ask, failed for whom? I mean, it may have failed for the population, but it doesn't mean that it's failed for the small sector of the population that's becoming extremely wealthy and powerful. In fact, over the last 30 years, which is a striking case. Take a look at the last post-war period, post-Second World War period. For the first several decades, from about 1950 to the 1970s, that was the period of the fastest growth in economic history, and it was egalitarian. The lowest portion of the population did about as well as the highest portion. It was also the period when some form of welfare state measures were introduced, not at the level of Europe, but some form. In fact, the quality of life improved. There are measures of that. And the indices that measure quality of life grew along with growth, economic growth. That went on until about 1975, roughly. At that point, the neoliberal principles were introduced, and it's gone the other way, just like in Latin America. So the indices of social health have declined steadily from the mid-1970s until today. They're now back what they were 50 years ago. Wages have stagnated. Productivity has declined. By every macroeconomic and social measure, the society has gotten worse. On the other hand, there has been enormous wealth accumulated in a very small sector of the population. And of course, U.S. power, the state power, has increased enormously. So is it a failed state or is it a successful state? Well, it depends what you think the goals of policy are. If the goals of policy are what Adam Smith described, it's a successful state. If you think the goals of policy are what rhetoric declares, it's a failed state. And I think the same translates to Mexico. For some sectors of the population, the state has not failed at all. For the narco-trafficking enterprises, for the multimillionaires, and so on. I mean, you know better than I do that in Mexico, since the rules were accepted, the rate of increase of poverty is roughly comparable to the rate of increase of billionaires. So is it failed or isn't it failed? Well, that's a value judgment, not a descriptive question. Of course, the population doesn't have to accept that. either in the United States or in Mexico. And one of the exciting things about Latin America is that for the first time there are very substantial efforts to to reject it and move in another direction. And the other directions are not particularly mysterious. I mean, you go back to the first decades after the Second World War, it's pretty well understood why economic growth was so rapid and so egalitarian. You take a look at East Asia, the East Asian miracles, pretty much the same. And in fact, if you look at economic history, it's pretty much the same. Throughout economic history, it's been remarkably clear that large-scale state intervention in the economy and maintaining sovereignty has been a prerequisite for economic growth. That was true of England, of the United States, of Germany, France, Japan, and so on. And imposed free market principles, what are now called neoliberal principles, are pretty much what created the Third World. They've been a disaster for populations as far back as you go. The lessons of economic history are pretty clear. The lessons of the past 50 years are pretty clear. And the same holds for gaining more freedom and justice in the society. These things don't come as gifts from above. They're always the results of popular struggle. They're always resisted. And it's always been the case in the past. It always will be. So...